This series discusses sexual assault and contains language that some may find offensive. Listener discretion is advised. When a lab tested DNA in 2005 related to the conviction of Fredrico Lobe, it posed a question that still hasn't been answered. It's still unknown who the DNA belongs to, and it's unknown whether the revelation of whose DNA it is could point to the guilt or innocence of Fredrico. While there's been a DNA mystery for the last 20 years, Fredrico has been saying for more than 37 years that he had nothing to do with raping a woman at Spring and Folsom in South St. Louis in 1988. He told then Circuit Attorney George Peach in a letter before trial that he was innocent. At his sentencing hearing, he also told Judge Richard Meehan in a statement that he didn't do the crime he was convicted of. His post-conviction efforts since 2001 have all fallen short, despite the DNA excluding him as the source in 2005. Centurion Ministries and Fredrico's lawyers contend the DNA belongs to the real rapist. But without having a match to show to a court, it's been an especially tough road in the Missouri legal system. A several-year investigation by Centurion Ministries and a local defense attorney culminated in 2014 with a petition in St. Francis County, Missouri, requesting Fredrico's release from a prison in the southeast Missouri county. The document is called a Petition for a Writ of Habeas Corpus. They were alleging Fredrico's detention was unlawful because he was actually innocent. In my first conversation with Jim McCloskey of Centurion Ministries, he said anyone looking at the case needs to read the document to really understand Fredrico's claims of innocence from top to bottom. He's also vying for the St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office to read it during its review of Fredrico's conviction.
I would encourage them, as I'm encouraging you, to read that writ.
Read that writ. It's got a nice ring to it. But I wouldn't describe reading the 65-page document as a walk in the park. That's because this case is not straightforward at all. There are contradicting statements from key witnesses. There's a police report with discrepancies on the suspect descriptions. There's evidence the defense claimed not to have seen until decades after the crime. The list goes on. That being said, if there's one document that explains every claim Fredrico has for his innocence, it's that one. The petition not only claims that someone else committed the rape Fredrico is doing time for, it goes as far to name an alternate suspect. This man lived in the same neighborhood where the crime happened. The 2014 petition includes affidavits from people who said this guy and Fredrico very closely resembled each other. One of the affidavits claims that the man said as much himself. People told me as well in interviews that this guy and Fredrico looked a lot alike. There was a big difference in this man's appearance, though, and that was prominent freckles on his face. So when the victim testified in 2007 that the rapist had freckles and that she hated that about his appearance, that they were scary to her, is it possible she was thinking of this man and not Fredrico Lobe? From First Alert 4, I'm Matt Woods, and this is Burden of Proof. One man's fight to show he's innocent. This is a true story about how difficult it is to prove actual innocence after a jury has declared you guilty. To understand the 2014 petition for habeas corpus, I needed to speak with the attorney who wrote it. I headed to a criminal defense firm in Clayton, just outside of St. Louis. I set up my equipment in the conference room of the office that overlooks other office buildings and apartments in the affluent suburb. And a few minutes later, a man with short gray hair and glasses walked in. As he sat down to talk, he bent his face slightly downward, his eyes peering through his glasses and the microphone in front of him covering his mouth as he spoke. His voice projected through the room in a grizzled tone.
Sindel.
Okay, that's what I thought. Just wanted to make sure.
Like Lindell.
Go by Rick, or do you want to go by Richard?
Yeah, Rick. I go by Rick.
R-I-C-K?
Yeah.
Rick Sindel is a longtime criminal defense attorney, and a well-respected one at that. He's argued cases in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in his decades of practicing law. He's spent almost his entire career in criminal defense. When I spoke with St. Louis Circuit Attorney Gabe Gore, he had high praise for Sindel.
He's been a defense attorney for a long time, and I had cases with him back when I was a federal prosecutor in the late 90s, early 2000s. So Mr. Sindel's a very, very well-respected attorney.
Sindel has been working on Fredrico's case alongside Centurion Ministries for more than a decade. The efforts to free Fredrico have been exhaustive, but still haven't borne any fruit.
This has been a torturous case.
Torturous?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's explain what you mean by that.
Well, it's just been so involved. There's been such a lengthy investigation that we went through. There was over 100-page petition that was filed with a lot of facts and a lot of material that was included, and we really anticipated that we would get some relief, and that hasn't happened yet.
It was after a judge denied Fredrico's release based on DNA that Centurion enlisted Sindel's help. It wasn't the first time he worked on an alleged wrongful conviction that Centurion had taken on. He also worked on the case of Ellen Reasonover, who spent 17 years in prison for a murder she didn't commit. The jury came within one vote of imposing the death penalty on Reasonover, but she got sentenced to life in prison instead. Reasonover had nothing to do with the murder and was exonerated in 1999. So Sindel was a familiar face. While New Jersey-based Centurion was taking on the case, Sindel was right here in St. Louis to handle the legal aspects, like filing court documents. While Sindel and McCloskey were reinvestigating the case, somebody told them about this man who also lived in the neighborhood and looked like Fredrico. According to one affidavit, there was a striking physical resemblance between the two around 1988. And so they followed that lead. Here's McCloskey.
We just did a complete investigation, found out who his relatives were, who his friends were, visited ex-wife, all kinds of people. And I went into his world and to identify people who knew him, who lived with him, relatives, etc.
After looking into him, McCloskey decided he would try to talk to him face to face.
Then I decided in 2010 to go knock on his door. That's how I first approached him. Didn't telephone him, just knocked on his door.
It was August 9th, 2010, when McCloskey said he showed up unannounced. It wasn't a given that he was going to offer up any information at all.
So anyway, I knocked on the door and I told him who I was and what I was doing. I didn't tell him that I suspected him. But I said, we're just interviewing a lot of different people who might be able to help us out in this investigation. We believe Fredrico's innocent, didn't do it.
According to McCloskey, the man not only spoke to him, he invited him into his apartment.
He was very friendly, non-defensive, very friendly. He had no idea I suspected him, though. He just thought he was another interviewee.
McCloskey wrote in a 2014 affidavit that the man had a light complexion and that the numerous freckles on his face were apparent. And as they were speaking in the man's apartment that August day 15 years ago, McCloskey said the man talked about how much he and Fredrico Lobe looked alike.
He said people in the neighborhood thought we looked exactly alike. You would think we were twin brothers, he said. He was very, very light-skinned. Very light-skinned. And full of freckles.
So this light-skinned man with the face of freckles had admitted himself that he resembled Fredrico enough to pass as his brother. And he was telling that to the person reinvestigating the case on behalf of Fredrico and trying to prove that Fredrico was innocent. McCloskey ended up going back to his apartment months later. This time, Sindel was with him.
Rick and I came back again because I wanted Rick to meet him. And Rick sat in the car, parked right out front. I knocked on the door, and my recollection is at that point in time, I don't know how many months later it was, he saw Rick sitting out in the car. He said, wait a minute, that's a lawyer. I don't want to talk to you guys. So that was the end of that. He didn't want to talk the second time around.
And so you never talked to him again after that point?
No.
They weren't going to get anything else out of him. McCloskey said they would have asked him for a voluntary sample of his DNA, but the man shut down the second time around. That avenue was closed. Sindel told me they looked for other ways to get his DNA.
I did do a trash search and around his house to see if I could locate sources for DNA, because we believe that his DNA may very well be the DNA that was on the underwear.
Really? So you tried to find...
Yeah, he was in jail at one point in time, and I was going to see if we could get his DNA from his jail stay, but when I found out he was in jail, I went there, and that very day he'd been released. So when I went to the workhouse to see if I could get a DNA sample, he was gone.
The workhouse is a former St. Louis jail in the city's North Riverfront neighborhood. It closed in 2021. And how would that work? Let's say you did find his trash or something. What would you actually do with it?
Well, we would submit it to the experts on the DNA that we had retained and have them examine it and see whether or not there was a match between the biological material that was found in her underpants and this individual's DNA.
Mm-hmm. So you would have tried to send that to this private lab that was previously contracted and had this unknown profile to see if something like a water bottle or something like that, if they could generate a profile and see if it was a match?
Yes, that was the idea. That was the goal.
Reliogene Labs in New Orleans had already generated a profile from the vaginal swab and underwear of the victim. If they had a sample from this other man, they could compare his profile to the unknown profile they already had. But because they weren't able to get a sample from him, it hampered their efforts to either include or exclude him. This other man that McCloskey interviewed has never been arrested or charged in relation to the May 1988 rape near Spring and Folsom. For that reason, I'm not going to name him in this story. But Centurion suspected him, in part, because of the close physical resemblance to Fredrico and the fact that he also lived right in the area where the rape happened. They knew the victim's 2007 testimony of the rapist having freckles that scared her didn't match Fredrico's physical appearance. And then they found the man who lived in the same neighborhood, was the same age as Fredrico, apparently looked like him, but also had prominent freckles. Fredrico told me he and the other guy knew each other since they were kids. They weren't friends, but they went to the same summer camp.
His mother and my mother, they were friends of the Good Neighbors Association back in the day.
When I talked to people who knew Fredrico and knew of the other man, they thought it was possible the identification of the rapist was a mix-up.
And Fred don't have no freckles. If you get any pictures of him, he don't have no freckles. But if she say Fred had freckles, we know who the fuck that was.
They kept talking about Fredrico having freckles all over his face. And I said, well, the only person I know of on the south side that has freckles on his face is a guy named...
All of us know who that was. That's the only motherfucker in the neighborhood that's black that's got freckles.
And the other guy was pretty light-skinned as well.
He looked just like Fred. He was a redder, See, like, Fred may look that color, but he was a redder little dude with freckles.
That's Tony Atkins, a close friend of Fredrico's. When I interviewed him at his house, he talked at length about this other guy in the neighborhood that they knew of. He couldn't recall his name, but said he remembered how he looked like Fredrico. Their hair color wasn't exactly the same, and the other guy had the freckles. Atkins said the cops should have known Fredrico doesn't have freckles, considering they had arrested him several times.
And the police that did that to Fred know Fred don't have freckles. You done beat his ass too many times. You done locked him up too many times. You go look at the mug shots. He don't have freckles. But this motherfucker here got freckles. You see the difference. And they didn't give a fuck. I bet you they didn't give a fuck if Fred got convicted or got away with it. I'm going to get you. And he got caught with that one.
Fredrico filed an internal affairs complaint against the two officers that investigated him for the rape, Reuben Hammond and James Long. He alleged they roughed him up during an arrest the year before the rape charge. The complaint was deemed not sustained by the police department's internal review board, and both of them denied it when I spoke with them. Officer Long testified right before the rape trial that when the victim first identified Fredrico in a phone call, she said he was light-skinned with freckles. Long and Hammond already knew of Fredrico from the previous arrests, so they knew what he looked like. I talked to someone else who knew Fredrico back in the day, Lamont Johnson. He's the brother of Stephen Whitfield, who was another one of Fredrico's close friends. Johnson talked to me in a phone call about this other man who lived in the neighborhood. I asked him if we could meet in person, so we got together on a Friday afternoon at Tower Grove Park in South St. Louis. We found an empty pavilion, and I started rolling the mics. And so how well would you say that you knew Fred back then?
Well enough where he would spend the night over our house or something like that. You know what I'm saying? Him and my brother was that close. You know, if he was to come over our house, he can just walk in.
Then we started talking about the other guy in the neighborhood. And this other guy who you're saying resembled Fred a lot back in the day, right around the same age, lived in the neighborhood.
Yeah, they could have been twins.
Really?
To me. Yeah, they could have been twins.
They look that much alike.
That much alike to me.
Johnson said he used to see this other guy because he lived next to a relative's house.
He stayed like in the building right next to where my son's grandmother lived, and that's where my son stayed. I would be there a lot, and I seen him coming in and out of the house. And I think I even told my son's mother one time he looked like Fredrico.
Johnson, like everyone else I've talked to who knows Fredrico, believes Fredrico was wrongfully convicted of the rape. Has anything ever happened that made you think he did do it?
No. I couldn't see it.
So you think that it could have been a mix-up, that it could have been this guy?
I believe so. Because the way this guy used to carry himself, and then the way he be out at night, he always going through the alleyways and stuff like that. So it didn't sit right with me.
Like going through the alleyways?
Yeah, he instead of walking through the street, he would go up an alley at night, you know, and that didn't sit right with me. And then the way he be looking at females and stuff, it was kind of creepy.
Court documents show the man was charged with violating an order of protection against his ex-wife twice in 2004. The ex-wife had obtained a restraining order against him. The petition for habeas corpus alleges the ex-wife, as well as a friend of hers, described the man as violent and abusive. After hearing about this man from several people, I decided to go looking for him myself. It's been 15 years since McCloskey talked to him at his St. Louis apartment, but I figured there was a good chance he still lived in the area, so I started looking for potential addresses and phone numbers. I was able to glean from court records that his most likely address was the same as it was in 2010, which appeared to be the last time someone has spoken to him about the Fredrico Lobe case. But then I found an eviction filing against him from about 6 years ago for that address. The other addresses that showed up looked like a long shot as well. The records I saw from the 2000s on all associated him with the first address. But I went ahead and knocked on the doors of both apartments in the St. Louis area just to see. And at both places, no one answered the door. The first apartment had one mailbox for both units. There was a sticker with a name on it, but it wasn't this guy's. The second place had a mailbox for each unit, and again, none of the names were this guy. There were several phone numbers that popped up when I looked for this guy, so I started calling around.
The number you have reached is not in service. This is a recording.
I got hit with a disconnected line 3 times. Another number actually rang. But after several minutes, no one picked up. Another potential number rang, but then said there was no voicemail set up.
Has not set up voicemail on 3148.
I tried the last 2 numbers again, but with no luck. My social media search for him also turned up nothing. His digital footprint is non-existent as far as I could tell. So I wasn't able to get in touch with this freckled man who looked like Fredrico. Him talking to me was a long shot to begin with. Fredrico's attorney, Sindel, laid out the argument against their proposed alternate suspect in a 2014 court filing. The document claims his resemblance to Fredrico and his prominent freckles make him a viable suspect. His name is included dozens of times in the court document. It lists how close he lived to where the crime happened. It says the 1970s Chevy that he drove around the time of the rape matched the description the victim gave to the police. It says how, by his own admission, he and Fredrico looked very much alike. He also admitted, according to the document, that he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and when he was younger had low self-esteem around women. Another aspect of the court proceedings Sindel was spearheading was another request for DNA testing. The vaginal swab and victim's underwear had already been tested, excluding Fredrico. But also kept as evidence was the victim's dress and other clothing. Sindel petitioned the court to have the dress tested for touch DNA. He also petitioned the court to have the unknown DNA profile from the sperm put into a national law enforcement database called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. If they could get a match, it would have the potential to exonerate Fredrico. As you might have guessed, the state objected to both the testing of the dress and putting the unknown DNA profile into CODIS. The Missouri Attorney General's office argued in responses to the requests that the testing of the dress would not prove Fredrico's innocence. And they argued that because the 2005 DNA testing was done by a private lab, the Missouri State Highway Patrol would not be able to put it into the law enforcement database. Here's what McCloskey had to say about that.
Technicality. If they wanted to get it done, they could have gotten it done.
Out of the 71 cases where Centurion has freed someone from prison, he said 12 got cooperation from the state where the person was incarcerated. The other ones, like Fredrico's case, they have to fight tooth and nail.
Even though we lay out what we think is a very provocative case and presenting a suspect, they're not going to send it to CODIS. They don't want to find out. They don't want to know.
You think it's that simple?
I do. Absolutely. I mean, hell, if you were an open-minded person who was really interested in the truth, why not? What's the harm?
The Missouri Attorney General's office included in its responses that Fredrico had offered no new evidence to support putting the unknown DNA profile into a national database. But how were they supposed to have new evidence on the unidentified DNA if the state was trying to deny them a path to identify it? Law enforcement are the only ones who can legally access and make submissions to the federal DNA database. So Sindel shot back at the state, attacking them directly. In his next court filing, he compared the state to an ostrich with its head stuck in the sand and called the Attorney General's office cronies. I actually printed out the last page of that document and had Sindel read it himself.
The state is more interested in preserving a conviction than discovering the truth. The ostrich, with its head deeply ensconced in the sand of its own making, willfully and maliciously denied petitioner access to this database, which could provide new evidence regarding the unidentified DNA evidence. Respondent and his cronies continued to deny an entirely reasonable request because they are not interested in justice or innocence, just preservation of a jaundiced verdict.
Those are pretty heavy accusations.
They are.
Despite the years-long effort to get in front of a judge, they were denied a hearing. They were denied additional DNA testing for the dress. And they were denied an exoneration. What would you have been able to present at that hearing that you think pointed to Fredrico's innocence?
Well, I think we would have been able to show that her identification of him as the perpetrator was flawed. We would be able to show that the investigation was flawed. We would be able to show that we had done everything we could think of to try to establish whether or not Fredrico's DNA was either on the dress or on the underpants, and the conclusion was that it wasn't in either place. We would have presented that and hopefully been able to convince a court that they got the wrong guy.
St. Francis County Circuit Judge Sean McCarver wrote in his 2016 ruling on Fredrico's petition that the alternate suspect allegation was nothing more than conjecture. Judge McCarver also made note that Fredrico's lawyers had not obtained a confession from the man they suspected.
You make your own judgment on that. We disagree. It was far more substantial than conjecture.
I believe he had mentioned, he didn't confess to it. Like that was the bar that it seemed like he was looking for.
It's a pretty high bar, don't you think? to confess to a rape, subjecting you to a life sentence in prison? Why would anybody expect him to confess to this crime?
The state succeeded in preserving its conviction of Fredrico Lobe. Now, he has one last shot at proving his innocence to a court. The St. Louis Circuit Attorney's Office currently has the case under review. That office has the legal authority to petition a court for someone's release based on a claim of actual innocence. On our last episode of the series, could Fredrico finally meet his burden of proof? You can listen to new episodes every Thursday wherever you get your podcasts or on firstalertfor.com. This podcast is produced and voiced by me, Matt Woods. If you want to get in touch, send me an email, matthew.woods@kmov.com with 2 T's on the first name. This is a First Alert 4 original podcast.